Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or is it afternoon? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. After these three really inspirational and positive talks, I must apologize to you if I'm going to paint a rather, in fact, a very gloomy picture in my talk. But I think it's very important to highlight the fact that biodiversity and the ecosystems and in general are in a state of catastrophe in the world. So please don't shoot the messenger. I'm also perhaps something like a pessimist, but I try and be a positive pessimist. And so I will try, and I will, at the end of my talk, give my perspectives of how I think we should proceed in at least addressing and mitigating some of the very bad situations we're in. I've had the wonderful pleasure and privilege of being able to spend 4 decades of my life studying Africa's large carnivores in 2 incredibly pristine areas, the Kruger National Park and the Kalahari Transfrontier Park. I've studied the little-known brown hyena, the much maligned and misunderstood spotted hyena. I've studied the mighty lion. I've studied the social wild dog, and I've studied the cheetah. Through the many hours and days and nights that I've spent observing these animals and their interactions with the environment and with each other and their adaptations has been very inspirational to me and has greatly modified and influenced my outlook on conservation. And I'd like to share this with you this morning. The African lion is probably the most iconic of the large cats. The fossil record tells us that lions evolved about 1.5 million years ago in Africa, and then moved out of Africa across Europe and Southern Asia, and by 500,000 years ago had got as far as the Americas. 10,000 years later, or 10,000 years ago, they were extinct in America due to the fact, probably, that another animal had come out of Africa, Homo sapiens. 6,000 years ago, which is basically the beginning of the historical time, the lion's distribution had shrunk to what we see in the red there. So it was found in Southern Europe, in Southern Asia, and over most of Africa except for the Sahara Desert and the Congo forests. In the last 100 years or so, as we see in the blue, its range has shrunk even further, and it is now a highly fragmented, smallish, has a much smaller distribution. In fact, it's probably lost something like 95 to 98% of its original distribution, and there's almost no doubt that this was mainly due to the influence of humans. And of course, it's not only the lion that has suffered from humans. A recent report brought out by the World Wildlife Fund says that the Earth is losing biodiversity at a rate seen only during mass extinctions. And shockingly, losses in vertebrate species, that's mammals, fish, birds, amphibians, and reptiles, have averaged about 60% between 1970 and 2014. A recent study has been done and published in a scientific journal where the authors have attempted to measure the biomass of mammals on Earth. In other words, the weight, the combined weight of all the mammals on Earth, and then to allocate them into a few different groups. And what they found was that 60% of the biomass of mammals on Earth are livestock, animals that we have domesticated: sheep, goats, cattle, camels, horses, dogs, cats. 36% of the biomass on Earth of mammals are us, are humans. So 96% of the biomass on Earth today consists of humans and their domestic animals, 4% wild animals, wild mammals. Birds don't do much better. It's calculated that 70% of birds are domestic birds, chickens, mainly chickens. Of course, it's not only loss of species that's important, it's habitat destruction, loss of net primary productivity. This, which is basically land degradation. Here we see on this map of Africa between 1981 and 2003 how the habitat has degraded. And basically the red and the darker and the oranges are the areas that have been most degraded. And there again, it's quite clear that the habitats are becoming more and more degraded. A study has shown that 1.5 billion people on Earth depend directly on degrading land for their livelihoods. And that can only lead to food insecurity. Food insecurity leads to conflict. Conflict leads to migration, very topical. We know a lot about migration today, and it's probably not going to go away. And biodiversity loss. A recent publication, 2017, the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a second notice, which was signed by 15,364 scientists from 184 different countries, was published in the journal Bioscience. Now this was a follow-up to the first notice of the Warning to Humanity, which was published 20 years ago. And this publication wanted to measure how much the situation had changed. In the first publication, they met the 9 ecological issues that the authors had identified as being important were examined, and it was recommended that unless we started attending to these, things are going to get much worse. So the results show, and you're not going to see this, I'm going to point it out to you, the only one of those 9 ecological issues that has improved is the one on the top corner there, and that's the ozone layer. So the line down the middle is where we were in 1972, and the line on the right is where we were in 2016. So the ozone level has improved, but all the others, fresh water resources per capita, reconstructed marine catch is down. Dead zones, that's areas of water that have lost all the oxygen due to nitrogen put in by humans, is up. Total forest, down. Vertebrate species, percentage, down. CO2 emissions, up. Temperature change, up. Population in billions of individuals, up. Ruminant livestock, up. About 20 years ago, Al Gore, the American politician, wrote a book called The Inconvenient Truth. I think we all know and heard about The Inconvenient Truth. And he was saying that basically that CO2 emissions into the atmosphere caused by humans was having a major effect on climate change, and that it was going to make things much, much more difficult for biodiversity. And of course, he was right. He was right about the emissions and about the climate change. But I think he was wrong about one thing, about the fact that he called that the inconvenient truth. The inconvenient truth is something very different. The inconvenient truth is the human population explosion. If we look here, this is the human population over the last 12,000 years. So up to naught, for about 10,000 years, the population stayed very low. And then suddenly, it started to increase. And of course, in the last few years, it's gone what I think you'll call viral. There's been an absolutely a huge increase in the human population. We are today at 7.5 billion people. When I was born, there were 3 times less people. The human population has trebled in the last 50 or 60 years. And the projection is that it's going to go to 11.2 billion by the end of the century. If we look at how this, since 1950, how the population growth has changed in developed as opposed to less developed countries, we see that in the more developed countries it's been very low, and in the less developed countries it's been very high. The projections are that Africa is expected to swell from 1.25 billion to 4.25 billion in 2000 at the end of the century. This has been almost swept under the carpet by politicians, religious leaders, business people, economists, and even conservationists. We do not address this incredibly important question that is really behind the problems that we have on Earth, the biodiversity problems, that combined with humans' insatiable appetite for using resources. My mind boggles to hear politicians talking today and business people of the wonderful opportunities in Africa, because the African population is going to increase, and this is going to create markets, and the economies are going to increase and improve. Now, I'm not an economist, but today we know there's huge poverty in Africa, there's lots of unemployment. I don't know how anyone thinks that when we've got twice as many people, the solutions are going to be any easier. So the problems and issues for conserving and maintaining even a semblance of the Earth's rich but fragile biodiversity are enormous. So what can we do? I think it's very important that we have to prioritize. We simply do not have the resources or the political will to be able to save everything. There's a growing concern, or there's a growing movement amongst conservationists to apply to a strategy that is used in medicine when there is a catastrophe, a medical catastrophe, and that is one of triage. And what it basically means is you decide the order of treatment when you have a large number of casualties. We need to choose what are the most important aspects that we need to look at. In our case, what will make the biggest contribution to biodiversity conservation? There's a lot of work going on, particularly in Africa, which is designed to look for ways in which humans and wildlife can coexist. Coexistence of wildlife is something we hear a lot about, and a lot of effort's been put into it. I ask the question, if we haven't been able to coexist with large predators for millions of years, or for hundreds of thousands of years, when our population was pretty low, how on earth is it going to happen as our populations increase? Certainly there have been some projects that have perhaps been successful in a small area for a small amount of time in saving some lions and so on. But I don't think that that is a sustainable way of doing it. I don't think we can really live with large predators and humans. Similarly, competition with livestock for grazing. The overgrazed, the degraded habitats are going to make it more and more difficult for wild animals to survive. We hear a lot about sustainable utilization. I maintain that in this day and age, it is an oxymoron. It is a contradiction in terms. We cannot live sustainably at the population we are in. I think I want to go back now and just discuss what is biodiversity, because I think a lot of people have an incorrect understanding of biodiversity. It's bandied around a lot. So biodiversity is not simply species richness or species diversity. It is a much broader concept. It incorporates composition, the makeup of the population, the structure, the landscapes, and functional attributes, the interactions between all these various components in the system, and it works at a whole range of different levels, from the genes right up to landscapes. I believe that the link between ecosystem functioning and conservation is absolutely critical. We need to conserve functions. So, for example, predator-prey relationships. Predators, the apex predators, the top predators, have a major impact in an ecosystem that filters right down, the cascading effects. They also provide the balances between the predators and the prey. It's not for us to say how many or how few there should be. They will sort it out if we give them the chance to function in this way. Even interrelationships between carnivores, between large carnivores, there again are important and also maintain the checks and balances in the ecosystem. So what I would like to propose is that we need to build up and establish or rehabilitate as many different ecosystems as we can in as many different landscapes so that we can get the full gambit of biodiversity protected in these smaller areas or in these particular areas that we choose to do it. These areas then must be secured, so we need to secure the borders, and I think a lot of the talks we've heard, three talks we've heard about this morning are very much involved in that. We need to get people to understand and to benefit and to be able to, the anti-poaching, to secure the borders of these areas. We need to secure the water, the natural water resources, but I don't think we need to manage the populations. That I would rather say we should leave to nature. We should allow natural selection and evolution to continue, because that's the only place on Earth that it can happen. We interfere far too much in the rest of our habitats. So if I can give you a take-home message, I would say the establishment and maintenance of large natural reserves protected against incompatible human use in as many different landscapes as possible is the key conservation requirement for biodiversity. So I hope that this could be the spark that ignites the restoration of biodiversity. Thank you.